In this lesson, we're going to have a look at the ovarian cycle. So to start us off, we're going to have a quick look here at the ovary. And as you can see within this ovary, starting over on this left-hand side, we have all these tiny little primordial follicles. Inside these primordial follicles is the development or the early stages of our oocyte. So think about our oogonium. Now from here we can see that the primordial follicles begin to develop, and they begin to develop into this thing called a primary follicle. And after the primary follicle, they continue to develop. And they develop until they reach something known as a mature follicle, or in some textbooks you might hear the name a Graafian follicle. As this follicle continues to grow, we can see it's filled with fluid. But the key thing for us today is we can also see these oocytes present in each of these follicles. Now, at the end of this process, we can see this follicle coming all the way around. We can see that the follicle itself ruptures and the ovum is released. So what we're going to be having a look at today in this ovarian cycle is what I've circled in red here, this process of oogenesis, what happens to these oocytes, and also what happens to these follicles in the ovary over that 28-day period. So, to start us off, a little bit of an overview of the ovarian cycle itself. This is the series of events that occurs specifically in the ovaries to mature an ovum. Now, while we say generally, and in the case of this lesson, we are going to talk about roughly 28 days in length, but in reality, we understand that it does range from 20 to 40 days in length. So when we talk about the ovarian cycle, we've had a look at some hormones previously, but the two key hormones that we really need to know a lot about in this lesson are released by the pituitary gland, and they are follicle-stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone. Now, at the time of birth, the ovaries of a human female contain thousands of primary oocytes. So if we come back up to our diagram here, we can see what I'll highlight in green is the primary oocyte, this in here. So when we're talking about these primary oocytes, they are surrounded by the primary follicle. And from puberty, some of those primary follicles will then undergo further development, leading into our developing follicles. So what we're going to look at today are three key stages present within the ovarian cycle. Number one is the follicular phase. Number two is ovulation. And number three is the luteal phase. So starting at the top here, we're going to look at each of the follicles found throughout the follicular phase. So to start us off, the primary follicle. This is what I've highlighted in green on the last slide, so we'll keep it consistent there. The primary follicle develops as levels of follicle-stimulating hormone, or FSH, and luteinizing hormone slowly increase. And what that does is it allows for the growth, it allows for follicles to reach the next stage of maturity. So what does that actually look like within the follicle? Well, the cells themselves form a wall of the primary follicle, enlarge, and they divide. And this creates a layer around that primary oocyte. So once that primary follicle has grown, has matured a little bit, we then start talking about this thing known as the developing follicle. Now, in terms of the developing follicle, the key thing that helps us to recognize a developing versus a primary follicle is the beginning of some creation of fluid-filled space. And what that does is it slightly pushes that oocyte over to the edge of this developing follicle. And at this stage, we can call that oocyte a secondary oocyte. Now, as the follicle continues to develop, eventually it reaches a stage known as either a secondary, a mature, or a Graafian follicle. And this occurs when that fluid continues to fill, and as a consequence, the follicle continues to enlarge. And what it does is it moves to the surface of the ovary. Now, when it gets to the surface of the ovary, it begins to form a bulge. Think of like a mole on your skin. It begins to peel through, or not peel through, but poke through the center of the skin. And in this case, the center of the ovary. And what happens is as these follicles are growing, as they get closer to the surface of the ovary, but they also release more estrogen and they release a low level of progesterone. So these are two other hormones that we've spoken about. So far in this lesson, we've spoken about FSH, LH, specifically in the primary follicle. And then later on, as we've gotten towards our secondary follicle, we've begun to speak about estrogen, and we've also a little bit of progesterone as well. And these hormones are released by the follicles themselves. So these ones over on the left are what we call the pituitary hormones, and if we were to put a name on these hormones on the right-hand side, they would be the ovarian hormones, as they're released by the ovary, or the follicle itself, I should say. So after the follicular phase, we move into about day 14, known as ovulation. And during ovulation, as we saw in our image right from the start of the lesson, this is when that secondary oocyte is released from the follicle itself. And this typically happens around day 14 of a 28-day cycle or in the middle of a cycle. But again, it's going to vary from woman to woman. And what we notice here is that this is a result of that high level of estrogen that we just spoke about. And what it does is it stimulates a spike in the level of luteinizing hormone and follicle stimulating hormone. That surge or that spike in the amount of luteinizing hormone is what causes the ovulation of the mature follicle. And while that follicle ovulates, while it bursts, the other follicles begin to degenerate. And this means that they are going to release less estrogen. Now, as that mature follicle bursts, it gets rid of the secondary oocyte, which is caught by the fimbriae, and they guide that secondary oocyte into the fallopian tube. When we talk about our final stage or final phase here, we're really talking about what happens to the remainders of the follicle. So when we're talking about the luteal phase, the oocyte has now left the ovary, the oocyte has headed towards its site of fertilization perhaps, or maybe no fertilization, and we'll talk about that in a second. But what we are going to look at now is the follicle itself. So the initial ruptured follicle is what is known as the corpus luteum. And the corpus luteum is a structure left by the remains of the follicle, and it secretes a high level of progesterone and estrogen. Now, as we've discussed previously, progesterone is what helps to maintain the thickness of the endometrium ready for implantation, and it also inhibits the release of follicle-stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone. Now, this is assuming that implantation is going to take place. And if implantation does not occur, we're left with something known as the corpus albicans. The corpus albicans is the result of the corpus luteum degenerating, and it's basically a big fibrous mass of scar tissue. Eventually, that corpus albicans is just going to disappear completely, and another ovarian cycle begins. And this, as a result, or this is due to that reduction in the levels of progesterone and estrogen, which should be released by the follicle itself. So that there is a look at each of the stages of the ovarian cycle, starting with the follicular phase from days 1 to 12, looking specifically at that follicle, having a look at day 14, ovulation, when that follicle ruptures, and then having a look at these structures after ovulation has occurred. Now, what we're going to have a look at very quickly is the two different scenarios that can occur post-ovulation, be it if fertilization does occur or if fertilization does not occur. So for the point of this lesson, we're going to start with if fertilization does occur. And if fertilization does occur, it means the end of the ovarian cycle, for a time anyway. And this is because the corpus luteum, that leftover follicle that we've just spoken about, is maintained by the hormone that we've learnt about previously, known as HCG, or human chorionic gonadotrophin. And this is released from the cells that will become the placenta, otherwise known as the trophoblast. Now, at a really low level, that progesterone and estrogen continues to be released by the corpus luteum, and as a consequence of that, it inhibits the release of our pituitary hormones. Now, once the placenta has finished developing, it's able, or not finished developing, but has developed a little bit more, it's able to release its own estrogen and progesterone, and then as a consequence of that, the corpus luteum will degenerate, and it'll degenerate in the same way into the corpus albicans. Now, once that corpus albicans has finished degenerating, and once the woman has finished going through that period of gestation or pregnancy, and also through breastfeeding, then at that point in time, the ovarian cycle usually resumes. On the other side of things, if fertilization does not occur, that corpus luteum develops up until about 8 to 10 days after ovulation. Not 8 to 10 days into the cycle, but after ovulation. So if ovulation is on day 14, this is happening anywhere on day 22 through to 24. Now, when we're having a look at this one here, we've already spoken about the corpus albicans forming from this corpus luteum, and that just being a big fibrous mass of scar tissue. And eventually it's going to disappear, but during that time when it disappears, no progesterone or estrogen are being released, and that causes the levels of folliculating or follicle-stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone to begin increasing again, triggering another ovarian cycle.